Some friends and I are stepping onto a path we wish we'd found years ago. Let's say this is a testimony from those of us who have been through it. You know that specific quiet after the kids are finally in bed and the house is still? It's in that silence where the feeling often settles in, the weight of all the compromises, the quiet hum of a life that looks successful on the outside, but feels like a series of obligations on the inside. It's the gap between the person you promised yourself you'd become and the functional adult you have to be every day. But what if this feeling isn't a sign that you're failing at adulthood, but rather that you were sold a faulty map to begin with? What if the real journey begins not by trying harder, but by finally understanding the rules they never actually told you? We all mix and sew this into something complete. We present it to you, and you won't find it anywhere else. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Your plans will fail, not because you're inadequate, but because life is fundamentally unpredictable, and clinging to control is a quiet form of self-torture. You might remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night, spreadsheets open, timelines color-coded, your 5-year plan laid out like a blueprint for peace of mind, only to wake up months later to a layoff, a diagnosis, a divorce, or simply the slow erosion of meaning that no Gantt chart could prevent. It often starts with a promise you made to yourself. If I just work hard enough, stay disciplined enough, anticipate every variable, I'll finally feel safe. But then the world shifts beneath you, not with a crash, but with a whisper, a missed promotion, a child's unexpected struggle, a friendship that fades without explanation, and you're left staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering why doing everything right didn't shield you from the ache of things falling apart. Psychologists note that humans possess a cognitive bias called the illusion of control, the persistent belief that we can influence outcomes far beyond our actual reach. This isn't weakness, it's a survival mechanism wired into us to reduce anxiety in an uncertain world. But when that illusion hardens into expectation, it becomes a trap. Sociologists call this the narrative fallacy, our need to impose clean storylines, beginning, middle, resolution, onto lives that are inherently messy, nonlinear, and resistant to tidy conclusions. The friction you feel isn't failure. It's the sound of reality rubbing against the rigid scaffolding of your expectations. Here's the quiet liberation in this truth. When you stop treating your plans as promises the universe must keep, you reclaim your energy. Accepting that plans will fail doesn't mean abandoning intention. It means shifting from attachment to outcome to commitment to response. You become less brittle, more adaptable. Instead of asking, why didn't this work out? You begin to ask, what's mine to do now? That question is where real agency lives, not in the flawless execution of a script, but in your capacity to meet the unexpected with curiosity instead of collapse. Knowing this doesn't make life easier, but it makes you freer. Free from the exhausting performance of having it all figured out. Free to grieve what's lost without blaming yourself. And free to build something new, not on the shaky ground of certainty, but on the solid bedrock of your resilience. And that's a kind of strength no plan could ever guarantee. You are replaceable at work. You might remember the exact moment you first felt it, not when you were hired, but years later, when you realized the company had already mentally moved on from someone who once seemed indispensable. Someone whose name still appeared on old project files, but whose absence barely left a dent in the daily rhythm of the office. Maybe it was when you saw your own responsibilities quietly redistributed during a 2-week vacation, or when you returned to find that the crisis you thought only you could solve had been solved by someone else, someone younger, or cheaper, or just different. and the world kept turning without missing a beat. That's when it hits you. The institution you've poured years into has no memory, no loyalty, no sentimental attachment to your specific contribution. You are a function, not a person. You are a role that can be recast. And no matter how many late nights you've worked, no matter how many problems you've solved, or how irreplaceable you felt in the moment, the truth is that your nameplate can be unscrewed and replaced within a week. Organizational psychologists describe this as role-based identity erosion, the slow, uncomfortable realization that your value to an institution is tied entirely to your output, not your humanity. Companies are not designed to love you back. They are systems optimized for efficiency and survival, and every system has redundancy built in. You are, by design, a replaceable part. This isn't cruelty, it's architecture. But here's the reframe. Once you stop expecting your workplace to affirm your worth as a human being, you become free. You stop conflating your job title with your identity. You stop sacrificing your health, your family, your peace of mind for an entity that would post your job opening before your seat was cold. Replaceability at work is not a tragedy, it's a permission slip. It's permission to set boundaries, permission to leave, permission to build your sense of meaning somewhere else, somewhere that can't be automated or outsourced or restructured. The people who understand they are replaceable are the ones who stop performing loyalty to institutions and start investing in things that actually matter: relationships, skills, autonomy, purpose. You're not irreplaceable at work, and that's precisely why you're free to become irreplaceable somewhere else, to your family, to your craft, to yourself. Your happiness is your responsibility, and no one is coming to save you. You might remember the slow creep of resentment that built up over the years. Resentment toward your job for not fulfilling you, toward your partner for not intuiting your needs, toward your parents for the childhood they gave you, toward the world for not arranging itself in a way that made you feel whole. It often starts with a quiet belief that happiness is something that happens to you when the conditions are right. When you get the promotion, when the kids are older, when you finally have enough money, when someone finally sees you the way you want to be seen. So you wait, you optimize, you check all the boxes, and then one day you realize you've been waiting for permission to be happy, waiting for life to apologize and make things fair, waiting for someone else to notice your suffering and fix it for you. But that moment never comes. No one is monitoring your emotional state. No one is responsible for noticing that you've been holding your breath for a decade. The people around you are too busy managing their own quiet desperation to rescue you from yours. Psychologists describe this as external locus of control, the belief that your well-being is determined by forces outside yourself. It's a survival mechanism from childhood, when your happiness really did depend on whether the adults around you were safe and capable. But you're not a child anymore. You're the adult now. And the hard truth is that if you're waiting for the world to give you permission to take care of yourself, to pursue meaning, to set boundaries, to ask for what you need, you'll be waiting forever. But here's the reframe. The moment you accept that your happiness is your responsibility, you stop being a passenger in your own life. You stop outsourcing your peace of mind to your employer's approval, your partner's mood, or the universe's sense of fairness. You start asking different questions. What do I actually need? What can I control? What small thing can I do today to move towards something that feels true? Responsibility isn't a burden, it's agency. It means you're not helpless. It means that even in a life full of constraints, you have the power to make choices that honor your well-being. You can't control what happened to you, but you can control what you do next. And that's not a curse. That's the only freedom you'll ever actually have. Your best might not be good enough, and that's not a failure of effort, but a feature of being human in a world that rarely rewards effort alone. You might remember the first time you truly gave everything. Maybe it was staying up until 3 a.m. to finish a presentation your boss called urgent, only to have it glanced at and filed away without comment. Or perhaps it was the months you spent trying to repair a relationship that kept fraying at the edges. No matter how many times you apologized, listened, or showed up. Maybe it was watching your child struggle in school despite your late-night help, your carefully packed lunches, your attempts to model resilience, and feeling utterly powerless when none of it seemed to move the needle. It often starts with a quiet moment of realization. You did everything you knew how to do. You emptied your reserves, you held nothing back, and still, the outcome wasn't what you hoped for. That silence after the effort, the one where no applause comes, no validation arrives, no miracle unfolds, is where the friction begins. It's not just disappointment. It's the dawning awareness that your dedication, your competence, even your love, operate within systems that don't always respond in kind. And that can feel like standing in an empty room, shouting into a void that never echoes back. Psychologists note that this dissonance between effort and outcome is a core source of what's called learned helplessness, but only when we interpret failure as personal inadequacy rather than as evidence of systemic complexity. Sociologists, meanwhile, point to what's known as the meritocracy myth, the deeply ingrained cultural belief that hard work reliably leads to success, which ignores the roles of luck, timing, structural inequality, and sheer randomness. In reality, your best is a variable, not a guarantee. It exists within constraints, time, resources, biology, and other people's choices that you cannot control. The discomfort you feel isn't weakness. It's your mind bumping up against the limits of agency in an unpredictable world. But here's where the shift happens. Accepting that your best might not be enough doesn't diminish your worth. It liberates you from a false contract. You were never promised that effort equals reward. That was a story sold to keep you striving without questioning the game itself. When you release the expectation that your maximum effort should always yield a proportional result, you stop measuring your value by outcomes you can't fully command. Instead, you begin to anchor your sense of integrity in the quality of your intention, not the verdict of the world. This isn't resignation, it's recalibration. It means you can show up fully, even when success is uncertain, because your purpose isn't contingent on external validation. You act not because it will work, but because it aligns with who you choose to be. And in that space, between effort and uncertainty, you find a quieter, sturdier kind of strength, the kind that doesn't crumble when things don't go your way, because it was never built on the fragile hope that they would. Knowing this doesn't make life easier, but it makes you freer. Freer to try without terror, freer to care without clinging, freer to rest, even when the work isn't done, because your humanity was never on the line. People judge you by your worst moments, not your average ones. You might remember a single conversation from years ago. Maybe you lost your temper in a meeting, or said something thoughtless to a friend, or failed to show up when someone needed you. And even though you've been kind and reliable 1,000 times since, that one moment is what people mention when your name comes up. It often starts with the sinking realization that no matter how much good you do, how many hours you've put in, how many times you've been patient or generous or present, one bad day can rewrite the entire narrative. You can spend years building a reputation as someone steady, someone competent, someone trustworthy, and then one mistake, one moment of frustration, one poorly timed comment, one visible crack in your composure becomes the story people tell about who you are. And the worst part is, you know they're not entirely wrong. You did that thing. You were that person, at least for a moment. And now you're walking around, knowing that somewhere in someone's mind, you're frozen in your worst version of yourself, and there's nothing you can do to update the image. Psychologists call this negativity bias, the well-documented tendency for negative experiences and information to weigh more heavily in our minds than positive ones. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. Remembering threats and failures kept us alive. But in social life, it means that one act of anger, incompetence, or selfishness leaves a deeper imprint than 100 acts of decency. People don't mean to be unfair. They're not villains. They're just human. And humans are wired to notice and remember what goes wrong. But here's the reframe. Once you accept that people will judge you by your worst moments, you stop wasting energy trying to control their perception and start focusing on what actually matters, your own integrity. You can't erase the past. You can't force people to update their mental file on you. But you can decide that your worst moment doesn't define your trajectory. You can apologize when it's warranted, make amends where possible, and then move on without spending the rest of your life performing redemption for an audience that may never forgive you anyway. The people who matter will see the full picture over time. The ones who don't, let them keep their version. You're not here to manage everyone's impression of you. You're here to become someone you can live with. And that person is built not by erasing your worst moments, but by refusing to let them be the end of the story. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Some of them simply become part of your architecture, load-bearing walls in the structure of who you've become. You might remember the first time someone told you that time heals everything, probably after your first real heartbreak or loss, and how desperately you clung to that promise like a life raft in dark water. You waited for the magical day when the pain would vanish, checking yourself each morning like monitoring a healing bruise, expecting the colors to fade from purple to yellow to nothing. But here you are, maybe decades later, and certain wounds still ache when the weather changes. The betrayal that rewired your capacity for trust, the loss that permanently altered how you experience joy, the failure that still whispers in your ear during important meetings. You've built an entire life, a successful one even, but these old injuries remain, not as active bleeding, but as scar tissue that pulls tight when you stretch too far in certain directions. Psychologists call this biographical disruption, the permanent alteration of your life narrative by traumatic events that cannot be undone or forgotten, only integrated. The research shows that pretending these wounds will disappear actually increases their power over us, creating what's known as the ironic process theory, where the effort to suppress thoughts makes them more intrusive. The real transformation happens when you stop waiting for these wounds to heal and start recognizing them as teachers that have already done their work. Your trust issues taught you discernment. Your grief taught you the weight of real love. Your failures taught you the difference between what matters and what's just noise. This isn't about glorifying pain or pretending everything happens for a reason. It's about acknowledging that you're not broken because you still carry these marks. You're seasoned. You're tested. You've developed a kind of emotional intelligence that can only come from accepting that some experiences leave permanent changes, and that's not a weakness. It's the most human thing about you. The wounds that don't fully heal become your early warning system, your depth gauge, your true detector. They're why you can sit with your kids during their first real disappointment and offer something more honest than empty promises about time's healing power. You can offer presence, understanding, and the hard-won knowledge that they're strong enough to carry whatever doesn't fade. to build something meaningful, not despite their wounds, but incorporating them into the foundation. You will be misunderstood fundamentally and repeatedly by people whose opinions matter to you, and no amount of explaining will fully bridge that gap. It often starts with something small, maybe a decision you made at work that seemed obvious to you but baffled your team, or the way your spouse interpreted your silence as anger when you were just processing, or how your parents still describe your career to their friends in terms that make you sound like you work in a completely different field. You find yourself over-explaining, sending follow-up emails to clarify your clarifications, staying up at night rehearsing conversations where you finally find the perfect words to make them see what you really meant. You've probably felt that unique exhaustion that comes from trying to translate yourself into terms others can understand, like being a native speaker of a language only you know, constantly working as your own interpreter. The worst part isn't the big misunderstandings, it's the accumulation of small ones. The colleague who thinks you're aloof when you're just focused. The friend who reads ambition as greed. The child who interprets your protection as control. Psychologists call this the illusion of transparency. We systematically overestimate how well others understand our internal states, thoughts, and intentions. Research in cognitive psychology shows that even in our closest relationships, we accurately understand each other's thoughts and feelings only about 35% of the time, barely better than chance. This is what sociologists refer to as fundamental attribution error, meaning curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine not knowing it, and we constantly forget that others are operating with completely different contexts, experiences, and mental models. A liberation comes when you stop treating being understood as a prerequisite for peace. When you accept this truth, you stop wasting energy on the impossible project of perfect communication and start investing in what actually works. Consistent actions over time, patterns that speak louder than any words could. You begin to see misunderstanding not as a failure, but as the default state, which makes genuine understanding, those rare moments of true connection, feel like the miracles they actually are. This doesn't mean you stop trying to communicate clearly. It means you stop expecting understanding as validation for your worth. You develop what might be called a private clarity, a solid sense of your own intentions and values that doesn't require external confirmation. The paradox is that when you stop desperately trying to be understood, you often become more understandable. Because desperation itself is a distortion filter, you can finally show up as yourself rather than as a walking explanation of yourself. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that authentic presence communicates more than all your words ever could. Your reputation is not in your control. It lives in other people's minds, shaped by their biases, needs, and stories they tell themselves about who you must be. You might remember the first time you discovered what someone really thought of you, perhaps overhearing a conversation or getting feedback that was completely at odds with who you know yourself to be. Maybe it was finding out that your thoughtful deliberation was seen as indecisiveness, or your efficiency interpreted as coldness. Or worst of all, learning that someone had spread a version of events that wasn't just different from yours, it was unrecognizable. You've probably spent sleepless nights crafting mental defenses, imagining conversations where you set the record straight, or worse, actually trying to manage your image through calculated behaviors, exhausting yourself performing a version of yourself you think will be properly understood. You check LinkedIn, worry about how emails land, wonder what's being said in meetings you're not in, and feel like you're playing a game where everyone else is making up the rules as they go. The most maddening part is the telephone game of it all. How a single misinterpreted comment becomes gospel. How someone who barely knows you becomes the author of your story in circles you'll never even know about. Sociologists call this the looking glass self. The idea that our sense of identity is largely formed by imagining how others perceive us. But here's what they've discovered. We're terrible at predicting what others think of us, and others are equally terrible at seeing us accurately. Research in social psychology shows that reputation forms through what's called spontaneous trait inference. People make immediate, unconscious judgments about your character based on minimal information, and these snap judgments become surprisingly resistant to change, even in the face of contradictory evidence. This is compounded by confirmation bias, where people selectively notice and remember information that confirms their existing beliefs about you. The freedom comes when you realize that trying to control your reputation is like trying to hold water in your fists. The harder you squeeze, the faster it escapes. When you accept this fundamental lack of control, something shifts. You stop performing and start simply being. You make decisions based on your values rather than their potential interpretation. You speak truthfully rather than strategically. You understand that your reputation is actually multiple reputations, as many as there are people who know of you. And they're all incomplete stories anyway. This isn't resignation. It's liberation from an impossible task. You develop what could be called reputational resilience, the ability to act with integrity regardless of how it's perceived, knowing that the people who matter will eventually see the pattern of who you really are, and those who don't see it were never your people anyway. Your energy shifts from reputation management to character development, from controlling the narrative to simply living a life that, when misunderstood, you can still respect in a mirror. Not all apologies will come. It often starts with a specific moment. Maybe a parent who never acknowledged the ways they failed you, a friend who betrayed your trust and simply moved on, or a manager who scapegoated you in a meeting and acted the next day like nothing happened. You wait, at first unconsciously, then with growing awareness, for them to circle back, to say the words, to finally see what they did. You might even rehearse what you'd say in response, how gracious or measured you'd be, imagining the relief that would flood your chest when they finally admit it. But years pass, and the apology never materializes. What's worse is that they seem fine, thriving, even, while you're the one still carrying the weight of what they did, like a stone in your pocket you can't quite let go of. Psychologists call this the apology gap, and it's one of the most destabilizing emotional experiences in adulthood because it violates our deeply ingrained sense of moral reciprocity. From childhood, we're taught that wrongdoing is followed by accountability. If someone hurts you, they say sorry, and balance is restored. But in the real world, most people are far more invested in protecting their self-image than in offering you closure. They've already rationalized what they did, rewritten the story in their minds, or genuinely forgotten it ever happened because it didn't cost them anything. The apology you're waiting for would require them to shatter that narrative, and most people simply won't do that. Here's the reframe. The apology isn't what you actually need. What you need is to stop outsourcing your peace to someone who's already proven they won't provide it. The moment you stop waiting is the moment you reclaim your energy. You begin to understand that closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you grant yourself by accepting reality as it is, not as you wish it were. This doesn't mean pretending the harm didn't happen or that you're over it. It means you stop letting their silence have power over your present. You start to see that carrying the expectation of their apology is like waiting for a bus that isn't on the schedule. It's not coming. And standing there won't change that. The strength comes from walking away from the stop. You learn to say, I know what happened, I know it was wrong, and I'm moving forward without needing you to validate that. That's not bitterness, that's liberation. It's the quiet, hard-won dignity of a person who refuses to let someone else's refusal to grow keep them small. You can do everything right and still lose. You studied the right degree, networked at the right events, married someone good, saved diligently, exercised regularly, and showed up on time for 20 years. And then the company restructures and your role is eliminated. Not because you failed, but because a consultant in another city ran a spreadsheet optimization model that didn't include your name. Or you raised your kids with intention and presence. Read all the parenting books, limited screen time, prioritized family dinners, and one of them still struggles profoundly. Not because you were neglectful, but because brain chemistry and peer influence and 100 invisible variables converged in ways you couldn't predict or control. You did everything the social contract promised would work, and yet here you are, sitting in your car in a parking lot at 11 p.m., wondering why the formula failed, why the effort didn't equal the outcome, why the universe didn't honor your end of a bargain you never actually signed. This is what they don't teach you, that life operates on probabilities, not guarantees, and that competence and virtue only improve your odds. They don't eliminate risk. The psychologists call this the just world fallacy, the cognitive bias that makes us believe good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, because the alternative, that chaos is woven into the fabric of existence, is too destabilizing to accept. We cling to the illusion of control because it makes the world feel navigable, like a video game where the right sequence of inputs produces the desired output. But the truth is that you live in a complex, adaptive system where your decisions intersect with market forces, genetic predispositions, other people's free will, timing, and sheer dumb luck. And here's the reframe. Once you stop fighting this truth, once you stop interpreting every setback as evidence of your failure or the universe's cruelty, you gain access to a different kind of strength. You can do everything right and still lose, which means your worth isn't contingent on winning. Your effort matters because it's yours, because it reflects your values and your commitment to showing up, not because it comes with a guaranteed return. This is the difference between fragile optimism, which shatters when outcomes don't match expectations, and resilient clarity, which says, I will do my best, I will act with integrity, and I will not mistake randomness for rejection. You are not broken when things fall apart despite your best efforts. You are simply awake to the way the world actually works, and that awareness, uncomfortable as it is the foundation of every mature decision you'll make from here forward. Your childhood trauma is yours to fix. You probably first felt this truth on a random Tuesday in your 30s, maybe sitting across from your partner during another circular argument about something small that suddenly felt enormous, or watching yourself snap at your kid over spilled juice in a way that made your stomach drop, recognizing your father's voice coming out of your mouth. You thought time and distance would be enough. You thought building a good life, a career, the mortgage, the family dinners, would somehow overwrite the old code. But there it was again, that specific flavor of anxiety before conflict, that need to control outcomes, that voice in your head, cataloging all the ways you're failing. And somewhere in that moment, you realized no one was coming to fix this for you. Not your parents, not your therapist, if you even have one, not your wife, not success itself. The wound may not be your fault, but the healing is entirely your responsibility. And that feels cosmically unfair, because it is. Psychologists refer to this as earned secure attachment. The concept that even if your early relational blueprints were formed in chaos or coldness, you can, through deliberate effort and self-awareness, rewire how you connect and respond. You're essentially reparenting yourself, teaching the younger version of you, still living in your nervous system, that the world isn't as dangerous as it once was, that vulnerability isn't fatal, that you can be seen and still be safe. It's slow work, invisible work, the kind that doesn't come with promotions or applause, and you'll have to do it while still showing up to everything else. But here's the reframe that makes it bearable. Owning this isn't weakness. It's the most adult thing you'll ever do. Every time you break a cycle, every time you choose differently than what was modeled for you, you're not just healing yourself, you're changing what your kids will inherit, what your relationships can become, and what you're capable of feeling. The strength isn't in having had an easy childhood. It's in refusing to let a hard one determine your ending. You're not broken. You're unfinished. And the person holding the pen now is you. Your potential is not an achievement. You've been carrying it around like a trophy you haven't earned yet. This story about who you could be if circumstances were different, if you had more time, if the job wasn't so demanding, if you'd chosen differently 10 years ago. Maybe you were the smart kid, the one teacher said could do anything, and that prophecy became a weight you've been trying to live up to while simultaneously hiding behind. You're 40 now, or close to it, and you've built a decent life, good salary, respect in your field, a family that depends on you. But there's this quiet, nagging sense that you're still just warming up, that the real you, the actualized you, is waiting in some parallel timeline where you finally wrote the book, launched the startup, mastered the craft, became who you were supposed to be. And the truth you don't say out loud is that potential has become the story you tell yourself about why it's okay that you haven't done the thing, whatever your thing is. Psychologists have a term for this: potential as a defense mechanism. When you identify strongly with your unrealized abilities, you protect your ego from the risk of actual failure. Because you can't fail at something you haven't truly attempted. Your potential is perfect because it's theoretical. It never gets rejected, never falls short, never has to face the marketplace of reality. It lets you maintain the identity of someone capable of greatness while avoiding the vulnerability of actually reaching for it. But here's what changes when you let that story go. You become free to be mediocre at new things, to build something imperfect, to stop auditioning for a role in your own life. The power isn't in what you could theoretically do. It's in what you actually choose to do with the ordinary Tuesday afternoon in front of you. Every person who's ever made something real had to trade their potential for presence, their someday for today, their perfect imagined self for their messy actual hands on the work. You're not going to unlock some secret final form of yourself. This is it. You're already here. And the moment you stop worshiping your potential and start spending it, you'll realize it was never meant to be saved. It was meant to be used, to be traded for something real, even if that real thing is smaller and stranger than you imagined. Friendships have expiration dates. You probably noticed it first with your college roommate or that work friend from your 20s, the one you used to talk to for hours, who knew your whole internal landscape, who felt like family. The texts got slower, the calls more logistical. The inside jokes stopped landing because too much context had accumulated in the silence between you. You tried for a while, scheduling dinners months in advance, liking their posts, sending the occasional, "we should catch up" message that both of you knew would dissolve into nothing. And then one day, you realized you hadn't spoken in a year, maybe 2. And it didn't happen because of a fight or a betrayal. It happened because you both became different people, moving through different lives, and the infrastructure that held you together just quietly dissolved. You feel guilty about it, like you failed at something fundamental, because we're taught that real friendships last forever, that letting them fade means someone didn't care enough. But the truth is, most friendships aren't built to survive the distance between who you were when you met and who you're becoming now. Sociologists call this friendships of utility and circumstance, relationships formed around shared context, like proximity, life stage, or mutual need. You're not lesser friendships. They're exactly what you needed when you needed them. But they were never designed to be permanent. You were close. You worked together. After all, you were both single because you lived in the same city and had the same bandwidth for spontaneous hangouts at midnight. When those conditions change, the friendship doesn't fail, it completes. And here's what makes this liberating instead of just sad. When you stop trying to preserve every connection on life support, you create space for friendships that actually fit your current life. You stop performing nostalgia and start investing in people who know the you that exists now, not the you that you used to be. Some friends are meant for a season, others for a chapter, and a very small number for the whole story, and all of those are valuable. The strength isn't in keeping everyone forever. It's in recognizing what each friendship gave you, releasing it with gratitude, and trusting that the people who are supposed to stay will stay, not out of obligation, but because the relationship keeps evolving alongside both of you. Let the old ones go gently. They already did their job. Your body will betray you. It probably started with something small. You bent down to pick up your kid's toy, and your back seized in a way it never had before. Or you noticed you couldn't read the restaurant menu without holding it at arm's length. Or you woke up with a pain that just decided to live in your shoulder now. No injury required, no explanation given. You used to be able to skip sleep, eat poorly, sit for 12 hours straight, and your body would just absorb it, bounce back, and keep performing. But somewhere in your mid-30s or early 40s, the contract changed without your signature. Now there's a knee that predicts rain, a metabolism that apparently quit while you weren't looking, and a tiredness that sleep doesn't always fix. You're doing everything right, or at least more right than you used to. And still, things are declining, creaking, requiring maintenance you didn't budget for, physically or mentally. It feels like a betrayal because you've held up your end. You show up, you provide, you keep moving, and your body is supposed to be the reliable machine that makes all of that possible. Philosophers have wrestled with this since ancient times, the mind-body problem, the uncomfortable reality that your consciousness, your sense of self, is trapped in and entirely dependent on deteriorating biological hardware. You are not your body, but you cannot escape your body. Every thought you have, every ambition, every moment of presence with your kids exists only because of electrical signals and chemical reactions that are, right now, slowly losing their efficiency. Your body has its own timeline, and it's not interested in your plans. But here's the reframe that makes this bearable. Accepting your body's limits doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. When you stop fighting the reality of physical decline and start working with it, you make different choices. You prioritize sleep, not as weakness, but as infrastructure. You move not to punish your body, but to maintain what still works. You recognize that energy is now your most finite resource, and you spend it accordingly. The people who age well aren't the ones who pretend nothing's changing. They're the ones who adapt, who build their lives around what's true, rather than what used to be true. Your body isn't betraying you. It's just being honest about its limits. And that honesty, if you listen to it, will teach you more about how to live than any amount of willpower ever could. Luck plays a bigger role than you're told. You probably felt this most acutely when you watched someone less capable than you get the promotion, or when your college roommate's mediocre startup got acquired for millions because they happened to know someone who knew someone, or when you realized the entire trajectory of your career started because you sent an email on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday and someone actually opened it. You've worked hard, genuinely hard, put in the hours, built the skills, made the sacrifices, and you're doing fine. Better than fine, even. But there's always that quiet dissonance between the meritocracy story you were sold and the random, arbitrary nature of how things actually shook out. You got into that college because the admissions reader was in a good mood. You met your wife because you happened to go to that party you almost skipped. Your kids are healthy because of a genetic lottery you had no control over. And the people struggling around you aren't there because they're lazy or unmotivated. They're there because the same random forces that lifted you happen to push them down. And pretending otherwise requires an exhausting level of delusion. Sociologists call this the just world fallacy, the cognitive bias that makes us believe people get what they deserve, that success is purely earned, and failure is purely chosen because accepting the alternative is destabilizing. If luck matters this much, then your achievements feel less like proof of your worth and more like accidents you happened to be present for. And that threatens the entire narrative you've built about who you are. But here's what shifts when you stop fighting this. You become more humble and more resilient at the same time. Humble because you recognize that your success isn't a moral referendum on your character. You're not better than people who have less. You're just luckier in ways that compound. And resilient because when things go wrong, when the project fails or the investment tanks or the opportunity evaporates, you don't internalize it as evidence of your inadequacy. You recognize it as variance, as the same randomness that helped you before, now moving in a different direction. The people who understand luck don't work less hard. They work hard while holding their outcomes loosely, investing effort without attaching their identity to results they can't fully control. You can do everything right and still lose. You can do everything wrong and still win. And once you accept that, you're free to focus on the only thing you actually control: showing up, being useful, and playing enough hands that eventually the odds tilt back in your favor. You are the villain in someone's story. Maybe it hit you when you ran into an ex years later and saw something flash across their face. Not anger exactly, but a kind of guarded distance that told you they'd spent time processing damage you didn't even know you'd caused. Or maybe it was your kid, now a teenager, who mentioned in passing something you said a decade ago that you don't even remember. But they do, and it shaped how they see themselves in ways you never intended. Or perhaps it was a former colleague whom you pushed out, professionally and correctly from your perspective, because the team needed to move faster and they weren't keeping up. But in their version, you're the person who destroyed their confidence and derailed their career. You've been carrying around your own story of yourself as fundamentally good, trying your best, meaning well, even when you mess up. And that story is mostly true. But it's not the only story. Somewhere out there, multiple someones have a version of you that doesn't match your self-concept at all. A version where you're the one who was cold, dismissive, selfish, or cruel. And no amount of your good intentions changes their experience of what you did. Psychologists call this perspective asymmetry. The gap between how we experience our own actions, which we see through the lens of our internal context, intentions, and constraints, and how others experience those same actions, which they interpret through their wounds, needs, and the information available to them. You know why you snapped that day, why you had to make that call, why you didn't show up the way they needed. But they don't live inside your reasoning. They only live inside the impact. And you can explain yourself forever, but you can't force someone to edit their story to include your justifications. Here's what changes when you accept this. You stop trying to control how you're remembered and start focusing on how you show up now. You can't go back and unbecome the villain in someone else's narrative, and trying to will only make you defensive, bitter, and smaller. What you can do is take accountability when it's offered to you. Apologize without demanding forgiveness, and make different choices with the people still in front of you. The freedom isn't in being universally loved or understood. It's in accepting that you're human, which means you've caused harm even when you didn't mean to. And that doesn't disqualify you from trying to do better. You're flawed, so is everyone. The work isn't proving you're not the villain. It's making sure you're not still writing those chapters. Your values will be tested by the life you've actually built. It probably happened during a performance review when you had to decide whether to protect the team member who wasn't performing but had a sick parent at home, or hit the numbers that would secure your own promotion and your family's financial stability. Or maybe it was the moment you realized the company you work for, the one funding your mortgage and your kids' college savings, operates in ways that contradict things you claim to care about: environmental responsibility, ethical labor practices, whatever your dinner party talking points are, and you decided to stay anyway because leaving would be complicated and expensive. You told yourself you'd be different, that when the moment came, you'd choose principle over convenience, integrity over security. But then the actual moment arrived, and it wasn't clean or dramatic. It was messy and ambiguous, and the principled choice came with consequences you weren't prepared to absorb. So you made the practical choice, the survivable choice, and now you carry around this low-grade cognitive dissonance between who you think you are and what you actually do when the stakes are real. Philosophers call this the integrity gap, the distance between our espoused values, the ones we genuinely believe we hold, and our enacted values, the ones that actually govern our behavior when resources are scarce and trade-offs are forced. Most people never have to choose between their values and their comfort because life doesn't press that hard. But adulthood has a way of engineering situations where you can't have both, where every option costs something you don't want to pay. And here's what makes this livable instead of just hypocritical: recognizing that values aren't pass-fail tests. They're compasses that help you navigate approximations. You're not going to win every moral dilemma cleanly. You're going to compromise more than you planned, rationalize more than you're proud of, and sometimes you're going to choose security over principle because you have people depending on you. And self-righteousness doesn't pay the mortgage. The strength isn't in never bending. It's in knowing when you're bending, in being honest with yourself about the trade you're making, and in ensuring that your compromises don't become your identity. You can work for a flawed system while still pushing it towards something better. You can prioritize your family's stability while acknowledging the cost of that choice. The people with real integrity aren't the ones who never compromise. They're the ones who compromise consciously, reluctantly, and only as much as necessary, and who keep trying to close that gap even when it never fully closes. Freedom requires sacrifice, and you don't get to choose what you give up. You probably felt this most clearly the day you realized your calendar had stopped being yours, that every margin of free time was already spoken for by someone else's needs, someone else's crisis, someone else's schedule. Maybe it was the weekend you wanted to disappear into a project or take a solo road trip, but your kid had a tournament and your parents needed help moving. And your wife had been holding down the fort all week and needed you present, actually present, not just physically there, but mentally available. Or maybe it was subtler than that. You're scrolling through someone's Instagram, Someone who took the risk you didn't take, who's traveling or building something, or living with a kind of autonomy you once imagined for yourself. And you feel that specific flavor of envy mixed with regret, the quiet acknowledgement that you traded that kind of freedom for this kind of stability. You chose the mortgage, the benefits, the predictable paycheck, the family structure, and all of those choices were good choices, defensible choices. But they came with doors that closed behind you, and no one told you how permanent that would feel. Existential philosophers, particularly Sartre, talked about this as radical freedom. The idea that we're condemned to be free, that every choice we make eliminates all the other possibilities we didn't choose. And we have to live with the weight of those foreclosed futures. You're not trapped because someone forced you into this life. You're trapped because you built it, brick by brick, decision by decision. And now the structure is load-bearing. The freedom you have now isn't the freedom to do whatever you want. It's the freedom to choose which constraints you're willing to live inside, which responsibilities you'll honor, even when they cost you. And here's the reframe that makes it tolerable. Freedom isn't the absence of obligation, it's the presence of agency within your obligations. You can't have everything, but you can be deliberate about what you keep and what you release. The person living in the van and posting sunset photos gave up security and community. The person grinding toward financial independence is giving up their 30s. Every version of freedom costs something. The power isn't in having no constraints. It's in choosing your constraints consciously, in building a life where the sacrifices you're making are in service of something you actually value, not just something you defaulted into. You're not free to do anything, but you're free to decide what matters enough to sacrifice for. And that's the only freedom that actually lasts. You will disappoint people, and some of them will never forgive you for it. Maybe you saw it in your father's eyes when you told him you were taking the safe corporate job instead of joining the family business. Or when you chose a different city, a different kind of life than the one he imagined walking you toward. Or maybe it's more immediate than that. It's your wife's face when you miss another dinner because the project is on fire. Or your kid who stopped asking you to come to their games because you've said, maybe next time, too many times, and they've learned to stop expecting you. You're trying, genuinely trying to show up for everyone. Your boss, your team, your parents, your partner, your children, your friends, who you keep meaning to call back. But there are more people than there are hours, more needs than there is capacity. And every time you say yes to one thing, you're implicitly saying no to 5 others. So you're constantly doing triage, constantly making impossible calculations about whose disappointment you can afford to absorb today. And the weight of all those accumulated letdowns sits in your chest like something you can't ever fully set down. Psychologists call this role strain, the stress that comes from holding multiple identities that make competing and often incompatible demands on your time, energy, and presence. You're a husband, a father, a son, an employee, a friend, and each of those roles comes with expectations that assume they're the priority. And no algorithm lets you optimize for all of them simultaneously. You can be a great father and a mediocre employee, or a great employee and an absent father. But the math doesn't allow you to be great everywhere at once. And someone is always going to feel like you chose wrong. And here's what shifts when you stop fighting this. You realize that disappointing people isn't a failure of character. It's a structural reality of having limited resources and unlimited demands. The goal isn't to never disappoint anyone. That's impossible, and trying will destroy you. The goal is to disappoint people consciously, to choose which disappointments you can live with based on what you actually value, not what you think you're supposed to value. Some people will be hurt, some will drift away, some will hold it against you forever. And that's painful, but it's also information about whether the relationship was built on who you actually are or who they needed you to be. You can't be everyone's hero, but you can be present and honest about your limits, and the people who matter will work with what you can actually give, rather than resenting you for what you can't. Your past never truly leaves you, no matter how far you run from it. You probably felt this most acutely during a perfectly ordinary moment. Maybe you were playing with your daughter and she looked at you with that specific expression of need mixed with trust. And suddenly, you were 7 years old again, watching your own father choose the newspaper over you, feeling that old abandonment loop through your nervous system like it happened yesterday, instead of 30 years ago. Or maybe it was in bed with your wife after a good day, and she reached for you in a way that should have felt safe. But instead, you felt yourself go cold and distant, because some ancient wiring in your brain still equates vulnerability with danger, still remembers what happened the last time you let someone that close. You thought moving cities would do it, or building a new life, or simply becoming a different person with a different tax bracket and different responsibilities. And you are different. You've grown. You've built something real. But the past isn't a place you left behind. It's a foundation you're still building on, and some of those foundational cracks keep showing up in the walls, no matter how many times you repaint them. Neuroscientists call this implicit memory. Experiences encoded in your brain and body that shape your responses and reactions without ever entering conscious awareness, especially experiences from childhood when your neural pathways were still forming. That version of you who learned the world was unsafe, or that love was conditional, or that your needs were too much for people to handle, that version isn't gone. It's integrated into your operating system, quietly running subroutines that influence how you parent, how you love, how you lead, how you protect yourself, even when there's nothing to protect yourself from anymore. You can't delete the past. You can't rewrite it. And pretending it doesn't affect you just means it affects you unconsciously, which is worse. But here's the reframe. Your past isn't a life sentence. It's a language you're learning to speak when you stop trying to outrun it and start recognizing its patterns. When you can say, this anxiety isn't about this meeting. It's about being evaluated by my father. Or I'm not actually angry at my son. I'm angry at the version of me who felt powerless at his age. You take back control. The past doesn't leave, but you can change your relationship to it. You can see it, name it, and choose whether to let it drive or just ride along. The strongest people aren't the ones with easy histories. They're the ones who've made peace with their ghosts, who've learned to carry the weight without letting it dictate the direction. Success can feel empty, even when you get everything you aimed for. You probably felt it most sharply the week after the promotion finally came through, or when you closed on the house in the good school district, or when you hit the salary number you'd been chasing for 5 years. There was a moment of relief, maybe even satisfaction, but then almost immediately this flatness, this, okay, now what, that you weren't prepared for because you'd spent so long assuming that reaching the goal would feel different, would feel like arrival, would finally quiet the restlessness that's been humming under everything. You look around at the life you've built, the title, the equity, the stability your parents never had. And objectively, you know it's good. It's what you worked for. But subjectively, it feels like you're watching someone else's life through glass. Like you executed the plan perfectly, but somewhere along the way, you lost the plot of why the plan mattered in the first place. And the worst part isn't the emptiness itself. It's the guilt and confusion that comes with it. Because you know people would kill for your problems, and you can't quite reconcile how you can be this fortunate and this unsatisfied at the same time. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill or hedonic adaptation, the phenomenon where humans quickly return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of positive or negative changes in circumstances, because we adapt to new conditions and then start measuring ourselves against new reference points. The promotion you fought for becomes your new normal within weeks, and suddenly you're eyeing the next level up. The house that felt like a dream becomes the place where you're still just you, with all your same internal weather, just in a bigger kitchen. Success doesn't fix you. It doesn't fill the holes. It just reveals that the holes were never about the external conditions in the first place. They were about meaning, connection, purpose, the stuff that doesn't show up on a performance review. And here's what makes this realization liberating instead of devastating. Once you accept that success won't save you, you're free to stop treating it like a finish line and start treating it as a tool. You can still want the promotion, the security, the options that money provides, but you stop asking those things to deliver existential satisfaction they were never designed to provide. The emptiness isn't evidence you chose wrong. It's evidence you're human, and human fulfillment comes from different variables than the ones capitalism taught you to optimize for. The people who feel most alive aren't necessarily the most successful. They're the ones who figured out what actually matters to them and built their days around that, regardless of whether it looks impressive from the outside. Success is fine, it's useful, but it was never going to be enough. And knowing that is what lets you go find what is. You will inherit your parents' flaws, no matter how hard you swore you wouldn't. You probably felt it the first time you heard yourself say something to your kid in that exact tone your mother used. The one that made you feel small when you were young. Or the moment you realized you've been avoiding conflict with your wife the same way your father did, just disappearing into work, into your phone, into silence. Because actually engaging feels dangerous in a way you can't quite articulate. You built your entire adult identity around not being like them, around correcting their mistakes, doing it differently, breaking the patterns. And in some ways you have. You're more present, more aware, more intentional than they ever were. But then there are these moments where you catch your reflection in their behavior and realize the thing you inherited wasn't just their eye color or their work ethic. It was their anxiety, their defensiveness, their way of loving people while keeping them at arm's length. Their specific flavor of emotional unavailability or control or martyrdom. You didn't choose this. You actively fought against it. And still, here it is, running in your code like inherited software you didn't know was installed. Developmental psychologists call this intergenerational transmission, the process by which patterns of behavior, attachment styles, coping mechanisms, and emotional regulation strategies get passed down not through genetics, but through modeling, through the 1,000 tiny interactions that taught you what's normal, what's safe, what's possible in relationships. Your parents weren't trying to damage you. Mostly, they were just parenting from their own unhealed wounds, operating with the tools they had, and you absorbed their limitations as instructions about how the world works. And now you're doing the same thing to your kids. Not because you're a bad parent, but because you can't teach what you haven't learned, can't model what you haven't integrated. The flaws don't skip generations just because you're aware of them. But here's the critical shift. Awareness is the circuit breaker. You will inherit the flaws, but you don't have to pass them on intact. When you catch yourself falling into your father's silence or your mother's criticism, that moment of recognition is where change becomes possible. Not immediate, not clean, but possible. You can apologize to your kid. You can say, "I'm doing that thing I do, the thing I'm working on." You can catch it sooner next time. The inheritance isn't optional, but what you do with it is. The strongest thing you can give your children isn't perfection or a flawless childhood. It's the model of someone who sees their damage clearly, takes responsibility for it, and tries to do better, even when it's awkward and incremental. You're going to hurt your kids in some of the same ways you were hurt. That's not failure. That's just how transmission works. But you can be the generation that names it, owns it, and starts the slow work of healing it. And that's how cycles actually break. Being a good person isn't a shield from pain, and the universe doesn't keep score. You probably felt this most viscerally when something truly unfair happened. Maybe your parent got the diagnosis, despite never smoking a day in their life, while the neighbor who burned through 2 packs daily made it to 90. Or when you watched your colleague who cuts corners and takes credit for other people's work get promoted, while you, who stayed late and mentored junior staff and played by every rule, got passed over with a generic email about budget constraints. Or maybe it was more personal than that. You tried to be a good partner, present and patient and willing to work on things, and they still left, still found someone else, still chose a version of love that didn't include you. And no amount of your goodness could change that outcome. You've been operating under this implicit contract. If I work hard, if I'm kind, if I do the right things and treat people well, then I'll be protected from the worst of it. But adulthood keeps handing you evidence that the contract was never real, that your character doesn't insulate you from randomness, loss, betrayal, or entropy. Philosophers and psychologists call this the just world hypothesis, the cognitive bias that makes us believe good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, because the alternative, that suffering is often arbitrary and meaningless, is too destabilizing to accept. We need to believe that morality matters in a transactional way, that virtue earns protection, because if it doesn't, then everything feels dangerously random and all your effort to be decent feels pointless. But the truth is simpler and harder. Being good doesn't exempt you from pain. It just changes how you move through it and what you leave behind. Bad things will happen to you regardless of how carefully you live, how ethically you operate, how much you sacrifice or optimize or care. And here's the reframe that makes this bearable instead of nihilistic. Once you stop expecting the universe to reward your goodness, you're free to be good anyway. Not as a strategy, but as a choice. You can be kind without keeping receipts. You can show up for people without demanding reciprocity. You can live according to your values without needing external validation that it mattered, because the point was never protection. The point was integrity, coherence, the ability to look at yourself clearly and recognize someone you respect. Pain is coming either way. Loss is inevitable. The only variable you control is who you are in the face of it. Being good won't save you from suffering, but it will save you from becoming someone you don't recognize when the suffering passes. And that's not nothing. That's the entire difference between surviving intact and surviving hollowed out. Your dream job is still a job, and it will disappoint you in ways you didn't anticipate. You probably felt this most acutely 6 months into the role you spent years positioning yourself for. The startup you joined because you believed in the mission, or the promotion that finally gave you autonomy, or the pivot into the field you were passionate about, and you realized you were still sitting in back-to-back meetings that could have been emails. Still navigating office politics and arbitrary deadlines. Still feeling that Sunday night dread creep in because Monday means performing again. Even if the performance is wrapped in a hoodie and startup equity instead of a suit and corporate bureaucracy. You thought loving the work would make it feel different. That passion would be the inoculation against burnout. That doing something meaningful would exempt you from the grind. But it turns out that even dream jobs come with tedious admin, difficult colleagues, budget constraints, and the fundamental reality that when something pays your mortgage, it stops being purely yours. It becomes transactional, obligated, and eventually, at least partially, a source of resentment. The thing you loved as a hobby, the thing you used to do to escape, now has performance metrics and stakeholders and the weight of your family's financial security attached to it. And that changes the neurochemistry of the activity entirely. Psychologists describe this as the overjustification effect. When external rewards, like money or obligation, are introduced to an intrinsically motivated activity, the internal motivation often diminishes because your brain starts to associate the activity with the external pressure rather than the original joy. You're not doing it because you love it anymore. You're doing it because you have to, because people are counting on you, because your identity and income are now fused to this thing. And suddenly the dream has the same flavor as every other job you've had. Necessary, tolerable, occasionally satisfying, but not transcendent, not the answer to your existential restlessness. And here's the liberating reframe. Once you stop expecting your job, even your dream job, to be the source of your fulfillment, you can relate to it more honestly and with less disappointment. Work can be good, meaningful, even deeply satisfying at times, but it's not going to complete you or fix the parts of your life that feel broken. The people who seem most content aren't the ones who found the perfect job. They're the ones who built a life where work is one component among many, where their identity and joy aren't solely dependent on what they produce or how their career is going. Your dream job will have boring days and frustrating people and moments where you question everything. That's not a sign you chose wrong. That's just what happens when passion meets payroll. The freedom is in knowing that, in taking the job seriously without taking it too seriously, and in building meaning outside the boundaries of your productivity. Love requires work, not just feeling, and the work never actually ends. You probably felt this most clearly during one of those long, quiet stretches in your marriage. Not the explosive fights, but the mundane Tuesday nights where you're both exhausted on the couch, scrolling separate phones, and you realize you haven't had a real conversation in days, maybe weeks, and the person sitting 3 feet away feels like a stranger you share logistics with. You remember the early years when everything felt easy, when desire and attention flowed naturally, when you couldn't wait to tell each other about your days, and you wonder what happened, whether you chose wrong or fell out of love, or if this is just what long-term partnership becomes, functional, familiar, and quietly disappointing. The feeling that made you choose each other, that consumed you in the beginning, has faded into something more like companionship or habit. And some part of you keeps waiting for it to come back on its own, for the spark to reignite spontaneously. But it doesn't, because that's not how it works. The early intensity wasn't love, it was infatuation. Neurochemistry, the brain on dopamine and oxytocin doing what it's designed to do, to get you to pair bond. And that phase has a biological expiration date. Psychologists call it limerence. That obsessive, all-consuming early stage of romantic attachment that typically lasts between 18 months and 3 years before your brain recalibrates and the person in front of you becomes real instead of idealized. What comes after limerence isn't the death of love. It's the beginning of actual love, the kind that's built through deliberate attention, through choosing to stay curious about someone you think you already know, through repairing ruptures instead of letting them calcify, through showing up even when you don't feel like it. And here's the reframe that makes this sustainable instead of exhausting. Love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you practice. And when you stop expecting it to feel effortless, you can start building it intentionally. The strongest marriages aren't between people who never get bored or frustrated with each other. They're between people who recognize that intimacy requires maintenance, that connection atrophies without attention, and who do the boring, unglamorous work of asking questions, planning dates, initiating sex even when they're tired, going to therapy, saying the hard thing instead of letting resentment build. The work isn't romantic, but it's what keeps the relationship alive. You're not going to fall in love every day. Some days it's going to feel like work, and that's not evidence of failure. That's just what love looks like when it's real, when it's past the easy part, when it's the thing you choose to tend because it matters, not because it feels good. Your memory is unreliable, and the past you're defending might not have happened the way you remember it. You probably felt this most uncomfortably during an argument with your sibling about your childhood. Maybe you brought up something your father did, some moment that shaped you, and they looked at you confused and said, "That's not how it happened," or "I don't remember it that way at all." And suddenly you're both describing completely different versions of the same event. Each of you certain your version is correct. Or maybe it was going back to your hometown and realizing the house you grew up in is smaller than you remember. The drive to school shorter. The neighborhood less magical or less terrible than the story you've been carrying. You've built entire narratives about who you are and why you turned out this way, based on memories you treat as factual records. But those memories have been edited, compressed, reinterpreted, and emotionally colored every time you've accessed them. And what you're remembering now isn't the original event. It's the last time you remembered remembering it. The story you tell yourself about your past is as much construction as recollection, shaped by your current emotional state, your identity needs, and the meaning you've decided to extract from your history. Neuroscientists call this memory reconsolidation. Every time you recall a memory, your brain rewrites it slightly before storing it again, incorporating new information, current emotions, and unconscious biases, which means your memories are less like video recordings and more like stories that change subtly with each retelling. The version of your childhood you carry, the version that explains your trust issues or your work ethic or your relationship patterns, might be partly true, partly exaggerated, and partly invented, and you have no reliable way to know which parts are which. Your sibling's version isn't more accurate than yours. They're just running different editing software on the same raw material. And here's what becomes possible when you accept this. You stop being so rigidly attached to your narrative. Stop defending your version of the past like it's an objective truth, and start recognizing that memory is interpretation, which means you have more freedom to reinterpret. You're not lying to yourself when you question whether things were really as bad or as good as you remember. You're acknowledging that your brain has been doing that work automatically your entire life. The past isn't fixed. Your understanding of it isn't final. And the story you've been telling yourself about what happened and what it means can be revised, not to deny your experience, but to free yourself from the version that's keeping you stuck. The power isn't in having perfect recall. It's in recognizing that your past is a story you're still writing, and you get to decide which details matter and what they mean about who you're becoming. You cannot change another person, no matter how much you love them or how clearly you see what they need to do. You've stayed up countless nights crafting the perfect words to help your father understand why his anger pushes everyone away. Or rehearsing exactly how you'll explain to your spouse why that defensive reaction damages your connection. Convinced that if you could just find the right combination of logic and compassion, they'd finally get it and transform before your eyes. But they don't. People only transform when the motivation comes from within themselves, when their own discomfort or desire becomes greater than their resistance, and no external pressure, no matter how well-intentioned, can manufacture that internal spark. You can offer information, model better behavior, set boundaries that protect yourself, but you cannot reach into someone's skull and rewire their beliefs, habits, or emotional patterns. That's their work, not yours. And pretending otherwise is like trying to digest food for another person. Here's what happens when you truly accept this. You stop exhausting yourself in the impossible project of other people's salvation. You stop monitoring your teenage son's every decision, hoping to prevent him from making your mistakes, because you realize he needs to build his own relationship with consequences. You stop giving your colleague the same feedback for the 5th time with mounting frustration, because you understand that your responsibility ends at clear communication. What they do with it is entirely up to them. You stop staying in relationships, hoping the other person will finally become who they could be, because you see that you're in love with potential, not reality. This truth doesn't make you cold or indifferent. It makes you effective. Your energy, which was scattered across a dozen people you were trying to fix, redirects toward the one person you actually can change, yourself. You become more honest about what you'll accept and what you won't. You waste less time on resentment, that particular poison you drink, hoping someone else will feel its effects. And paradoxically, when you stop trying to change people, you sometimes create the space where they can change themselves, because they're no longer defending against your pressure. You can't save anyone, but you can stop drowning while trying. Your fears are often rational. You're lying in bed at 2 a.m., heart thudding, not from caffeine, but from the quiet dread that you've built a life on shifting sand, that your job could vanish in a restructuring email, that your child's future is being shaped by forces you can't control, that the love you've nurtured might one day quietly evaporate, not with a fight, but with a sigh. This isn't paranoia. It's perception sharpened by experience. Modern adulthood rarely comes with guarantees, only probabilities, and your nervous system has been paying attention. Psychologists call this realistic anxiety, the kind that arises not from imagined catastrophes, but from legitimate uncertainty in a world where stability is increasingly an illusion. Unlike neurotic fear, which fixates on what might go wrong in a vacuum, realistic anxiety responds to actual stakes, mortgages, aging parents, climate reports, and the slow erosion of trust in institutions that once promised order. Society, however, has trained you to treat all fear as weakness, something to be numbed, outrun, or manifested away with positive thinking. But suppressing rational fear doesn't make you brave. It makes you brittle. The reframe isn't about eliminating fear, but honoring it as data. When you stop labeling your unease as a personal failing and start seeing it as a signal, your mind maps real risk in a complex world. You reclaim agency. You stop wasting energy fighting the feeling and start asking sharper questions. What part of this can I influence? Where should I prepare, not just hope? That shift from denial to discernment is where resilience is forged. Accepting that your fears are often rational doesn't trap you in despair. It frees you from the exhausting performance of pretending everything's fine. It lets you build a life not on the fantasy of control, but on the steadier ground of responsibility, the power to meet reality as it is, not as you wish it were. And in that clarity, you find something quieter but more enduring than optimism, the grounded courage to act wisely, love fiercely, and rest deeply, even when the future remains unwritten. Quiet desperation is a real choice. You feel it most on Sunday evenings, standing in the kitchen while the dishwasher hums and your kids laugh in the next room. Everything looks fine, even admirable, from the outside. But inside, there's a hollow ache, a sense that you're living someone else's script, trading your days for security, comfort, or the quiet approval of people whose opinions you no longer even respect. This isn't just burnout or midlife fog. It's the slow accumulation of unspoken compromises. Saying yes when you meant no. Staying when you knew you should leave. Postponing what matters because the cost of change feels too high. Sociologists and philosophers, from Thoreau to modern behavioral scientists, have long observed that many adults don't collapse under crisis, but under the weight of deferred authenticity, the gap between who they are and who they've allowed themselves to become. Quiet desperation isn't forced on you. It's what happens when you consistently choose short-term ease over long-term alignment, when you mistake survival for living. And yes, circumstances constrain us. Bills, responsibilities, obligations. But within even the tightest margins, there are choices. To speak up, to redirect, to redefine success on your own terms, even in small ways. The reframe begins when you stop seeing your resignation as inevitable and recognize it as a pattern of decisions, however understandable, that you're still making, consciously or not. That realization isn't a condemnation, it's an invitation. Knowing that quiet desperation is a choice, however layered in duty or fear, returns agency to you. It means you're not trapped, you're negotiating, and every negotiation can be revisited. This awareness doesn't demand you quit your job or upend your life tonight. It simply asks you to stop lying to yourself about why you stay. From that honesty, clarity grows. You start making micro choices that honor your values. A boundary here, a reclaimed hobby there, a conversation long avoided, and those accumulate into a life that feels less like endurance and more like intention. Accepting this truth doesn't make you reckless. It makes you responsible, not just to your family or your role, but to the self you still carry beneath the routines. And that responsibility, far from being a burden, becomes the quiet source of your strength. The world is indifferent to your story. You feel it most acutely in the quiet aftermath of a setback. A project you poured your soul into gets deprioritized without discussion. A personal loss goes unnoticed by colleagues, who ask only about deliverables. Or you wake up one morning realizing no one is tracking your sacrifices, your growth, or your silent struggles the way you do. This isn't cruelty, it's neutrality. The universe doesn't keep score, doesn't root for you, doesn't even notice when you've been good or deserving. Philosophers like Camus called this the absurd, the collision between our deep human need for meaning and a cosmos that offers none by default. Psychologically, we're wired to narrate our lives as coherent journeys, heroic arcs with cause and effect, justice and resolution. But the external world operates on systems, randomness, and scale, not narrative logic. Your pain, your effort, your intentions, they matter intensely to you, and perhaps to a few close others, but they carry no inherent weight in the machinery of markets, bureaucracies, or natural forces. And that's not a flaw in the world. It's simply its nature. The reframe begins when you stop waiting for external validation or cosmic fairness and start building meaning from within. Accepting the world's indifference doesn't diminish your life. It liberates it. It means your worth isn't contingent on being seen, recognized, or rewarded. It means you're free to define success on your own terms, to act with integrity, not because it guarantees an outcome, but because it aligns with who you choose to be. This truth strips away the exhausting performance of trying to make the world care, and in its place offers something sturdier: autonomy. You become stronger, not by demanding the world acknowledge your story, but by writing it anyway, quietly, deliberately, without needing an audience. In that space, you find resilience that isn't shaken by indifference, because it was never built on approval to begin with. And paradoxically, that's where your story gains its deepest authenticity and its quiet power.